Hi, welcome to the video. In this one we're going to have a look at the 2019 pre-release for the IGCSE Computer Science. And if you've watched any of my previous videos, I'm going to take a different approach here. We're going to really focus on the pseudocode and not so much on the actual programming, because that's really the key skill that you need in the exam. So let's jump straight in. In every pre-release you get these 3 bullet points regardless of what the task is. So I'll just break these down a little bit and give you a few pointers. So first of all, your program or programs must include appropriate prompts for the entry of data. Data must be validated on entry. And then we have error messages and other output need to be set out clearly and understandably. And finally, all variables, constants and other identifiers must have meaningful names. So let's just look at a couple of examples. So when you're taking an input, I'm using the sort of exam board pseudocode style here. You could do something like input name, but that's not quite what they're looking for. So what we should be doing is something like a prompt with a print, or you sometimes see that done as output, and then input the name and then validate it. So for something like a string, we might check that the length is not equal to 0, for example. They don't say how we have to do validation, but we should do some validation. So I wouldn't get in depth with things like what data type has been entered, have they entered a string or an integer necessarily. That might be a bit more complex than the expected GCSE level. And again, error messages, so we've got here print invalid, try again, that type of thing. Okay, second example, really about this last bullet point. So identifiers, like the variable and constant names you use, should be quite clear to understand what they are. So generally, a one-letter identifier isn't a good idea. I've seen this from students of mine who like to give their variables sort of funny names or short names, but the exam board don't like that kind of thing. So it shouldn't look like that. It should be more like this, a very clear name for your variables or constants. Okay, so we've got that out of the way. Let's get on to the main task now. So we're going to be looking at the version of the pre-release that is being studied in the UK and other countries. There are 3 different zones in the world. But the one that I'm teaching in my classes is this one about the buses. So we have the table, and basically there are 6 buses. There are 4 weeks, just looking at the weekdays, Monday to Friday. And as it says at the bottom, the positive numbers are minutes that bus arrived early. The negative numbers are how many minutes late, and any zeros mean the bus is on time. So for example, bus A, you can see it's got 1, 2, 3, 4 lates. Okay, so what do we have to do? Task 1, bit of a misleading title, setting up the data storage. We don't really store it permanently, we just put it into arrays. Okay, as I said before, I'm going to really try and focus on the pseudocode style that the exam board use, although I teach using Python as the programming language. Now in Python we don't have arrays, we have lists, so I've been encouraging my classes to get in the habit of talking about arrays and maybe approaching how we insert data into the arrays slightly differently than you would in Python. So let's have a little look. I've just used the data from the sheet there for bus A, and what we're going to try and do is for all 6 buses either enter the data that's given on the pre-release task, or let the user type in their own data. So this second sentence says it must be possible to enter the data supplied or your own set of data. Now in practice you won't really want to have to type in over 100 sets of data to test your program. So there's different things you could do. You might reduce that to only having a couple of buses, or you might reduce the number of days and weeks that you cover in your program. But just again, think ahead to the exam. In the exam they're not going to ask you to do something very repetitive, but they might ask you to set up 1 bus, for example, and store the data in an array. So what we're going to look at later on, if we structure it like this with 3 separate buses, what we can do is use the index in the array to search based on a particular day. So it's important that you think of these buses as, the arrays as being kind of lined up so that we can look at a day of the week and find the data for that day. But that's a bit further on in task 3. So task 1, what we're going to do is basically iterate or loop through the array and gradually insert the data that the user gives us. Now, again, just to emphasize the difference between pseudocode and Python, I've given you two things to look at here. So here's my little attempt at pseudocode. Slight mistake in that I haven't finished off my for. I should have had at the end here next, or next I. That's what the exam board would put at the end of a for loop. In Python, we indent for the code inside the loop, and then we just unindent to carry on. So apologies there, slight mistake on my part. I am only human after all. So another difference in pseudocode, the for loop looks like this. For I equals 1 to 20. They tend to start at 1 rather than 0. Whereas in a Python for loop, we write it as for I in range. We would start at 0 typically for an array because there's 0th index. And Python stops 1 before this kind of end value here. So that would go from 0 to 19, which is 20 spaces. The pseudocode way is actually, in a sense, easier to understand. It goes from 1 to 20. So let's try and stick with that. Just for comparison, I've put in the number here of the index that we're looking at. So if the user inputs the number 2 in the first instance, with this input command here, or the Python equivalent int input, what I can do in the pseudocode is like an arrow helps you understand that we're directly inserting it into index I of the array. So let's think again, the first time round index I is 1. That's what's stored here. Or if you want to look at the Python equivalent, the 0 here. So at that point we're going to insert what the user has entered in that point. Final point there to make is that we're trying to get away from the Python way of appending data to a list. That's not what we're doing. We're inserting directly into a position in the array, an index. Okay, and that will proceed. So we'll move along to the second time around the loop. So I in the pseudocode is now 2. Let's say the user has input as 0. So the input here is getting stored in index 2. So there goes the 0, and so on. So that's what we want to do in the first instance. Loop through. Here's our first negative, and -1 has been input, so that's gone in index 3, and so on. Okay, so there's my pseudocode. Again, bear in mind this is just one way to solve the task. There are many ways to get through this, but this was my thinking. So a clear message to say what we're doing. In my case, I let the user choose. Do they want to just use the supplied data? And if they choose yes, then it's going to basically have the arrays with the predefined code in it. That's just my way of speeding up my testing of the later on tasks. But actually for the exam board, let's look at this first half. So if they choose no, then we'll do it the standard way, which is to set up an array. Here's how we might set that out in pseudocode. So an array that goes from index 1 to index 20. Again, it's easy to understand. It corresponds well to the for loop, which is going from 1 to 20. And as we just saw, it's going to output a message, enter minutes, and then whatever the input gets put into that index in the array. I've been lazy here. I'm not going to write it out 6 times, so I've just done a comment, repeat for all buses. And in the exam, I very much doubt they'd ask you to repeat code over and over. You know, bus B, bus C, bus D. That would be silly. So chances are they'll just ask you to do it for 1 or 2 buses. Okay, so that's task A done really. Let's move on. So task 2 gets a little bit more complicated. We've got to analyse the data that we've input. So we've got 4 aspects. The number of late arrivals for each bus route. So in practice what that means is, here's bus A, we're going to have a look through. There's a negative, there's a negative, there's a negative, there's a negative. So bus A has 4 negative numbers. So that's what we've got to find. Okay. Second point, the average number of minutes late for each bus route. So what we're going to have to do in this case, they mean the average as in using all the numbers, all 20, regardless of positive or negative for this second bullet point. So again, we're using a loop, we'd go all the way through, have a total variable that adds them all up, including the negatives, and if I've done my maths right, that gives us a total of 22. And then because it's an average, we're dividing by how many there are, which is 20, and that should give us 1.1 for bus A. Okay. Third point, the bus route with the highest number of days on which it was late. So we've already figured out that there were 4 late buses for A. We'd have to do the same for each bus. So we could do that by having a variable that stores which bus has the most late days so far. And after we've checked each bus, just compare the value. So for example, if we've already know that A has got 4 lates, when we look through B, let's say that, I don't know, B has 6 late buses, then we could compare the 6 with the 4, it's greater, so now we know that B is the worst one so far, and so on for each bus. And then finally, the fourth bullet point is the average number of minutes late for each bus, using only data from days on which it was late. So we need to go back to what we did really in the first task. For bus A, there were just these 4 here. So what we're going to do is take those 4 numbers, -2, -5, -1 and -2, add them all together, and that will give us -10. Depending how you read the question, you might want to leave that as a negative, but I thought I'd convert it to a positive. So if I multiply the -10 by -1, that would give me 0. Again, you could do other things, you know, other methods of doing that. And then finally, there were 4 late buses, so I've got to divide 10 by 4 to get 2.5 negative minutes. Okay, so if you're programming the task yourself, and you know, whilst using this video, there's some values that you can use to compare your solution with and see if you got the right thing. Let's break that down a bit further. Here's the pseudocode. We first of all just set up the variables. So I'm going to store how many days late the worst bus has had so far. Start that at 0, so assign it the value 0. I'm going to have a string variable to see which is the latest bus so far, and then for each bus I need how many late arrivals it's got, the total minutes late, that's positive or negative, and then the total negative minutes late. So again, I've tried to make my variable names quite clear. Even if they're long, it's better to do that and be clear what it exactly means. Notice these are stored as what we call real numbers, or in Python you might call it floating point numbers. We'll get to why that is the case in a minute. So next set of pseudocode is just a for loop again. We've gone from 1 to 20, or the way I did it here was the length of the list. So bus A list dot length is a kind of pseudocode way of getting the length of the list. And then similar to what we did in task 1, we're going to use this variable. I called my variable mins because it's, you know, minutes that are stored in the array. So if bus A mins, so first time round that would be 1, is less than 0. So what that means is we have a look in this first index, and again you can see the updates to the variables down here. Mins is 1, so we're looking at that 0 there. That's what we get here, bus A mins. Is that less than 0? Well, no, it's not. So we actually skip past this part of code, get to the end if, and we've got that variable where we need to add up the total minutes. Now it's kind of pointless here because it's a 0, so we don't need to add anything, but what that does is take the 0 and add it to 0 and store it in that variable. So really not much change there. Let's zoom along the line a bit because they were all zeros. So when we hit the number 2 here, we're up to index 4 on mins, and we've got our first proper value. So it's not less than 2, so we jump down here, we add the current value to total mins late. So that was 0, it's now jumped up to 2. Okay, let's move on a bit further. Next value, same thing happens, so it was another 2. That 2 gets added to the previous total, so now that's at 4. Let's whiz on a bit further. Okay, so if I add up all those numbers across there, we'll get up to the total of 15 so far. And we've still not gone inside this if, because there's been nothing less than 0 so far. Next one is our first time when we do hit a negative number. So if bus A mins is less than 0, which it is because it's -2, then what we're going to do is add 1 to our number of late arrivals. So far we've had 1 late arrival for this bus A. And then what we're going to do is keep track of how many minutes late we've had. So again, I added in this multiply by -1 part so that it would store whole numbers. You perhaps don't have to do that, that's your call really. So in my example, total negative minutes late now stores 2 because it's taken that number 2, removed the minus sign and added it to this variable. Let's whiz on a bit further. So hopefully you've seen the process through enough by now. I've whizzed all the way along, so mins is now 20, the index down here. And by that point, as we saw before, we should have got to a total of 22. And total negative minutes has ended up as 10. So it's added up the -2, the -1, the -5 and the -2. And I'm really hoping my maths is right on that. Okay, but obviously you'd rely on the program to get it right for you. After we've done all that, that's just bus A done. So now we need our nice output messages. So print the number of late arrivals, print the average minutes late. I've just thrown it all in one line here, dividing it straight by 20. You may want to do that as a separate variable to find the average. And again, I made a little mistake here, so I've had to add an extra little part with the star here. What you might find at that point, if oh sorry, it's not that point, it's for this one here. On the late arrivals, you may actually have had no late arrivals. So if there was a particular bus, I think if I remember rightly, bus B doesn't have any late arrivals. So when you try and divide by 0, you will hit an error. It's impossible to divide by 0. So just to avoid that problem, I've added in this little statement here. If late arrivals is equal to 0, then I'm going to set its value to 1. So what that means is when I divide by that number, 1, it's not going to change the value, so it won't cause any trouble, just to avoid an error that you will come across with bus B. Okay, and then finally, this is the part that's going to check, is this the worst bus, like the latest bus so far? So if A's late arrivals is greater than the most days late that we've had so far, then we know that A is the worst bus. Now it must be the worst so far because it's the first one we've checked. So we're going to set most days late to however many late arrivals A has had. And we're going to set this latest bus string variable to the value A. Okay. Then again, I've done a little comment here. After all the buses are complete, so if we've done the same for B and C and D, it will have gone through and it will have checked if B late arrivals is greater than the most days late, then it will be B that is the worst one so far. So at the point of doing A, the most days late so far is 4, and the latest bus is A. But that will change as you go through the process, because I think there are later buses than A in there. Okay, and finally we want to output which bus had the most days late. Just to be on the safe side, let's check that there were some buses with late days, because you may enter all positive data, and then none of them would be the latest, would they? They'd all be positive. So just to make sure I checked, is it greater than 0? And there we have it. Okay, so that's task 2 done. Swiftly moving on, task 3. So in this one we've got to let the user type in a particular day, like Monday 1 or Friday 1 or Monday 2, whatever it might be. We've got to find out how many buses were late on that particular day, and for each of those buses, say the name of the bus, like bus A or B, and how late the bus was on that day. So let's just visualize that a little bit. If I choose Monday 3 as my input, I can look at this array and basically compare it with the other arrays. I've just shown bus A and B here to keep it short. So for example, if we're looking at bus A on Monday 3, it's got a -5. If I'm looking at bus B, it was a positive number, 1. So bus A was the only one that was late there. Now here there's a couple of ways you could go about this. I thought what I'd like to do is set up some more arrays, just in case we hadn't had enough of creating arrays. I'm going to take all the data from these different arrays and I'm going to store it in an array that here I've called check array. Just a way of making it a bit simpler to access the data. So just visually it's like plunking that -5 into here, and I'll have a separate one with the labels like A, B, C, D, and that 1 is going to get plunked into there. Okay. And then once we've set that up, it's easy to work our way through again, just like we did in task 2. Work through that array to answer the requirements of task 3. Okay, so there we go, moving along. Bit of a needless animation there. Right, let's see that in pseudocode. So you are going to need to set up an array of the days. Bit of a boring task to type them in. Just a little aside here, if you want a quick way of doing that in Python, getting Python to do the work for you, you could pause the video and borrow my code here. So that's going to set up that array for you, and you just have to do that and then print out the days list array. This is not something I'd recommend doing in the exam. This is just a little shortcut for when you're coding it if you're using Python. So here's my main pseudocode. I've got a variable day number which is starting at 0, and I've got another one late on day which I've set to 0 as well. print statement here, please enter a day for analysis, e.g. Monday 4, and then the user is going to input whichever day they have chosen. And then I'm going to loop through the list. This time I've called my index variable pos. It's going to go from 1 to the length of the list, just like in task 2. And if that the item at that position is equal to the day that they have chosen, then we'll know that we're in the right position. So again, just visually, if I was to have typed in Monday 4 as my day chosen variable, so if that's what I've input, it will get stored in this day chosen variable, and then when I do the loop, it's going to say if days list pos equals day chosen. So what I'm doing here is looping through all the numbers step by step, sorry, not through the numbers, through the days, and looking for the string that they've typed in, mon4, and once I find it, I can get that index and I can store that. So it's getting the pos from the for loop and saving that in this variable here, day number, just so we can keep track of that for the next section. So day number in my example is 16 from here. Okay, next is to try and set up the array the way I chose to do it. You don't have to follow this method, but I just thought it'd be quite neat to do it this way. Oh, sorry, just skipped ahead a bit too quickly there. So I've set up the array with 6 spaces in it, and I've looked in in check array index 1. So this position here, I want to get bus A's value from that day number index that we just found out. So what that's doing is putting that data in the right places. And here you can see where I've got buses equals ABCD to just quickly set one up for the labels to make it easy to reference them. Okay, then what we're going to do is use that list we've set up, that array, not list. This is pseudocode, not Python. And we're going to loop through it from 1 to 6. We're going to check if it's less than 0, so we can find just the late buses. And if it is less than 0, we're going to add 1 to our little counter here, the number of late buses. So just num late add 1. And we're going to output a message. Bus, whichever bus this is, like bus A, was late by, and we're going to look in the array. Again, I opted to multiply it by -1 here, and I had to just pop that minutes there to finish off my string at the end. Okay, so let's see that in action a little bit. First time around the loop, index is 1, and we've hit a negative straight away, so num late would go to 1, this line of code here. Num late equals current value, which is 0 from the start, plus 1. Move along, we've got a positive, so we'll, for index 2, we'll just skip around here and go back to the start again. At this point we hit another negative, so we are going to add 1 to num late, so we now store 2, and then we'd carry on through. And while I'm doing this, I've just seen it. Another error of mine, sorry. I've ended my for with the word n4. Don't do that. That's me messing up again. That should say next index or just next. So apologies for my mistake again there. Okay, moving along, we've got again not a negative value and not a negative value. So having looped through my 6 positions in this array, I've found 2 negatives, 2 late buses. So that's stored in num late. And that is about it. So hope you found that useful. Sorry, it's been quite a long process, but hopefully you can pause that video and use it. The idea being really you can use this while you're planning your pseudocode yourself, but also when it comes to nearer the time of the exam, which is in early May this year, you can use this video to review the logic behind the task and decide, obviously, if you want to approach it the same as me, that's great, or if you've got a better way or a different way of doing it, of course that's your call. I'd really not recommend that you use 2D arrays or 2D lists, even though that would be a much better programming solution to this task. It's it's not on the IGCSE specification, so it's probably best to avoid those in general and be confident that you're approaching it the way the exam board will have it on the mark scheme. I have heard that they will accept answers that use techniques not on the mark scheme, but it's just best to avoid those. Okay, time for me to stop talking. Hope you found this useful. Please do like and subscribe and all that business. Thank you very much.